father, Herbert, your Opa, was born in 1894, and he was the Jewish faith. They were not a religious family, but that was their background. And as you know, that was not a very healthy thing to be when it got to be the 1930s. But before we jump to that, he lived in Halle. He was born in Halle, and he and his father had a business of rags and papers that would make more paper. They sold that. They were middlemen. And one day he went to a nearby resort town of Bad Salzuflen with a friend to play tennis. And on the next court were two nice young girls also playing tennis. And so they decided to play mixed doubles. And that was the beginning of Herbert and Helen's turn, starting to mix it up. Helen was a blue-eyed, blonde German, and there was some consternation in the family when she elected to wed a somewhat older, widowed Jewish man who had a 6-year-old daughter. But they loved each other dearly, and they did get married, and almost lived happily ever after. He was in the German army and was a good soldier and loved his country very much and was proud to serve. He was a widower. They were married in 1927 because their first child, which was me, was born in 1928, just makes the 9 months.
And so August 26, 1928, you
There,
come on the scene.
I come on the scene, yes.
Okay.
And of course it was wonderful times all over the world. Everybody was rich and everybody was happy. And then came the crash of '29, and things went south everywhere. And that brought into power in Germany Adolf Hitler, who had some very different ideas about who Germans were and what Germany was. And he wanted only pure Germans, no Jews, no Poles, no Lithuanians, no anybody else. And life became very uncomfortable for my family. And fortunately, we escaped the horrors. We suffered only what I choose to call small indignities. For example, because of the Jewishness, we were no longer allowed to have Aryan household help. And as a child in school, I was not allowed to stand up when they sang the national anthem. I had to stay seated. We had to go to only Jewish doctors, and many things that I don't even know about. One of the things that I do remember was that I wasn't allowed to join the Hitler Jugend, which was like the Brownies. It was the precursor to the teenage club, and I couldn't really understand why. It just, I found it a sad thing, and I remember that. And so my grandfather convinced Herbert that things were only going to get worse, and he needed to get his family out of Germany before things got worse. And so it was decided to emigrate to America, where his younger brother had already emigrated in the 20s, Fritz. But he was the second son, so he wasn't going to be part of the family business in the same sense the first son was. So he came in the 20s, I don't know just when. Hitler didn't come into power until '33. And so it was from 1933 on that things began to get really, really bad. There was always anti-Semitism, but not of the type that Hitler brought. So Herbert, of course, had to provide for his family, 3 girls and a wife. And so he made the trip to America to find a job in 1935. And this story you have heard many times. It is my favorite
Well,
story of
right.
all time because it is such a commentary on the good people in this world. Herbert came to the United States and had contacts through business, and he went to one of those contacts, Tony DiBenedetto, and asked for a job, and they determined that he would be useful in setting up a new export-import department in Tony's company. And so they made a deal, and they shook hands, and my father went home. No contract, no nothing, just they shook hands. And a year later, in 1936, Herbert packed up his wife, his 3 children, and all his household goods, and came to America on that handshake. And the job was indeed there. When I say all your household goods, that meant more household goods than anybody ever thought of having, because at that point you could no longer take money out of Germany. And so any money that you had, any wealth, had to be converted to household goods. Mm. So they bought all new furniture. They had linens to last them for the next 20 years. The girls had grow into clothes for the next 10 years. But everything that they could convert into stuff, they did. Sewing jewelry into hems and things like that. I know that was done later, but I don't know it about my own family. Getting ready to go to consume that whole year, 1935 to 1936. We went to Langeoog for more than a vacation, which I didn't realize at the time. Langeoog is an island off the North Sea where my aunt lived, and it's important as a coastline installation, which came into importance later on. And they bought all the household goods that they could, converting the money. The other thing I do remember is once we boarded the ship, the Amsterdam, as we left Germany, my mother was crying. And we were going on this wonderful ocean voyage, and I couldn't understand why my mother was crying. And it was many years later that I put it all together. I did not realize that we were leaving permanently, although we had been told some interesting things about the new place we were going to live. For example, that there were black people, which of course we couldn't remember, and that there was chewing gum, and we had no idea what chewing gum might be. But this would be in the new place we were going to live. But at that age, I was 8, not quite 8, you don't really have a sense of geography. If you're going to live in someplace new, it could be 2 blocks down the road, or it could be across an ocean. And didn't understand that there would be a different language or any of that. I can tell you something about my father's family that did not leave, did not believe it was going to get so bad, and eventually they all got out. Nobody ended up in a concentration camp. However, their passage out, and I don't know the years, one family got out through France and then Spain, and finally came here. The other family, my uncle's family, my aunt's family, Santa Thea, her family went to Denmark, and then when Hitler hit Denmark, they got out through Denmark. I don't quite know how my grandmother and grandfather, Robert and Paula, got out, but they did get out, and I think they were the last ones to get out, so I don't know how that happened. But all of them did ultimately get out.
And did everybody go to New York City?
Everybody went to New York City, yes. Everybody goes where everybody else is, where family is, which is one reason I'm back in Albany, New York, because I went back to where family is. I have no recollection of Ellis Island at all. My first recollection is the house that we rented, a 2-story building in Astoria, in Queens, and we lived up in the upstairs apartment. But that's my first recollection of being in the United States, and then, of course, the first school year here. Oh, that first school year, I was the most fortunate of children because I had a teacher who, number one, had taken some German in college, and number two, just loved the idea of having a little German girl in her class. They put me back into first grade, even though I was 8 years old, because I had so much catching up to do. And she worked with me every afternoon, teaching me English and making my life so much better, and teaching the other children to accept me, and giving me jobs like being the monitor who brought the cookie box to the front of the room. And she said, "Thank you," when I brought it up. And I started to go back to my seat. And she said, "Well, what do you say when I say thank you?" And I said, "Please." And the whole class laughed. And she gave them a long lecture about the word in German for "you're welcome" and "please" is the same. And so I was translating literally, and they were not to laugh. And I learned, that's how I learned "you're welcome." The end of the school year, I had advanced to my right grade. They put me into the second grade at mid-year, and then into my right grade, third grade, at the end of the year. So within a year, I had learned the language and was caught up with my peers. I have very few recollections about how Eva managed. Of course, she was going to kindergarten. She had no reading and writing and arithmetic to learn and all that. The only thing I can remember about Eva is coming home from kindergarten and having learned a song. "Amelia, baby flowers, open their eyes and sing." And we couldn't make any sense out of that. And it was quite a long time later, and I don't know how we finally figured out that Amelia was a million. So I remember that. My dear sister Eva, she's 3 years younger, and just a wonderful, wonderful human being. My older sister Marlies, whom I adored, because of course she was the older sister and knew everything, and yet she wasn't a grown-up, did not have an easy time of the transition. You can imagine 14 is a horrible year for any teenager. You're half child and half adult, and the cultures clashed terribly. She started off in high school when every other kid was starting off high school being equally inept. And so nobody was there to give her support. And it was a different culture for teenagers here. Dating was something that was unknown in Germany for teenagers. And so she had no support at home or in school. She had a very difficult time of it. Well, you asked me about what else I remember about Germany and how things were different. And one thing that comes to mind was birthday celebrations were really big occasions. And one of the things that happened that I remember so fondly is the birthday child always received a wreath made of flowers that my mother made for us. And she carried that on here for a long time. You ask about my giving Sam, your firstborn, on his first day of school, what we would call a cornucopia, and which in German is a Tüte. And there is a picture of me, which you may have among your things, of a first day of school. And one of the things is you're holding this Tüte, this full of goodies. And also, you have, what is now a backpack, but it was a rucksack that every child got. And that's another interesting difference. When we came to this country, of course, I had a backpack, and it was the strangest thing. Nobody here had a backpack. It was a completely unknown thing. I had my rucksack, and also I had a coat with a hood on it. Nobody here had a hoodie. It was just amazing to everybody. And one of the people that it was so amazing to, all these little things that she saw, was my third grade teacher, Florence Chambers. And she was so interested in the cultural things that she observed with me that I went home and told my mother. My mother said, well, if she's so interested, why don't we invite her to come visit us? Which we did, and Flo Chambers came, and my mother became lifelong friends, and we're the best of friends all their lives. It was probably my mother's best friend in America. There was a time when I hated her profoundly because I couldn't do the arithmetic in third grade, and she wadded up my paper once and threw it on the ground, but I forgave her for that years later. My schooling in this country was really pretty nice. We ended up moving in 1940, 41, I don't remember exactly, to Whitestone in Queens, which was a nicer community with a better school. And I was fortunate to have them at that time bring in a change agent principal. And so we did wonderful things. There was an 8th grade school, and the 7th and 8th graders were treated differently under this new system. And we had elections, and we had cheerleaders, and we had just a wonderful time of it. So I really enjoyed my happiest years was 7th and 8th grade, and by that time I was able to really make friends, which was wonderful. I should interject here something about, we were not well off, of course. We were not poor, but money was very, very tight. And so, speaking of being cheerleaders, one of the things I remember my mother doing, she took her gray flannel dress and she cut it up. And she made a gray skirt for me because that was the cheerleading uniform. We all had to buy the sweaters. Well, we had to buy sweaters and skirts both, but that's how I got my gray sweater, my gray skirt to go with my maroon sweater with a big PS 79 on it. Oh, my mother made many sacrifices like that, and she never liked sewing any better than I ever liked sewing. Oh, that was another thing with sewing. In 7th grade in sewing, no, in 8th grade in sewing, we made our own graduation dresses, and we were the last class to make long white dresses for graduation. And so I did that, and my mother helped me, and I never have liked sewing since. When the war came, as I said, I graduated in 1942 from 8th grade, and we were now at war, and we were enemy aliens. And that, for me, was a horror, because, for one thing, I had to carry papers, identification papers, and they were to be with me at all times, and of course I didn't want anybody to know that. And I had a special zippered pocket in my notebook that I kept those in, and nobody saw them. But that didn't always work, because I had a boyfriend whose family owned a boat, and I was invited to go boating with them on Long Island Sound on several occasions. And again, we had to carry papers, anybody out in the open waters. And one time we did get stopped by the Coast Guard, and everybody had to show their papers. And mine were a different color, which they spotted immediately because they were enemy alien papers. And as a 16-year-old, I died of embarrassment with my boyfriend and his family. But somehow I survived that. I believe my parents became citizens about the same time around the mid-40s. It's a little mixed up. I think Dad became a citizen first in 1944, and then my mother became a citizen in 45, and my citizenship papers date from 1945. So that's when I became a citizen, and then graduated high school in 46. I remember that my family was very excited and happy when they were both citizens, but it wasn't anything like there seems to be today of parties of recognition by other people. But again, I was I was a teenager interested only in myself, so I was just happy I didn't have to carry the papers anymore. The end of high school, I have two stories about going on trips with my dad. One, he worked on Saturdays, so I went with him in the city, New York City, and we went through the Hasidic section of Brooklyn. And of course, I was most interested as a youngster why those men were wearing those long black coats and those tall hats, and why they had those two long curls going down the sides of their faces. And my dad explained to me that they were Hasidic Jews, and they had beliefs that were not shared by everybody, but they believed that God had told them in the Bible that they were not to cut their hair. But after many centuries, they determined that that was not really very healthy, and so they made a little deal with God, and they said, God, we're going to cut our hair because really this lice business is not a good thing. But to honor you, we will keep a curl on each side of our head. And so they made that little deal with God. And then Dad said to me, and that's what we all do. We all make our private little deals with God. And that's one of the most important religious lessons I ever got. Another story about my going with Dad on a business trip. This was going up into New England. I think it was in Massachusetts, because that's where all the paper mills were, and that was his business, of course. And it was going to be an overnight trip, and we were going to stay in a hotel. And before we went into the hotel, this is in the 40s, in the United States, in Massachusetts, my dad said to me, make sure your cross that you're wearing around your neck shows when we walk up to the desk. Because there's a great deal of anti-Semitism. And with a name like Stern, and with my dad's very Jewish features, he might have been refused entry to a hotel in Massachusetts. So those are two trips with Dad. And what else? Oh, the other trip with Dad was going to the aquarium. I got to go to the aquarium with my dad, and that was our reward, because we had both been so gotten chunky, very fat, that my mother put us on a diet. And so if we reached our goal, whatever that was, I don't remember, then we would have a treat. And my treat for reaching the goal of not getting fatter was to go to the aquarium with my dad. And now I'd like some of those pounds back. My Germanness continued to show itself. I am now grown, married, young. I was just 20 years old, and the first Thanksgiving, it wasn't Thanksgiving even, it was in the fall, I was making this pumpkin pie to surprise my husband. And he came home. He was going under the GI Bill to Syracuse University at the time. And he came home, and he said, oh, that smells good. What is it? And I said, it's pumpkin pie. Oh, he says, let me see. And he opens the open door, and he starts to laugh and to laugh. I said, what's the matter? He says, who ever heard of a pumpkin pie with a lid on it? Well, this little German girl never had made a pie in her life. Her mother had never made a pie in her life. I didn't know you didn't put a lid on, a cover on a pumpkin pie. We had kuchens. We didn't have pies.
You had a top crust on the
Yes,
pie.
I did. I had a top crust. Your own birth, of course, is a story I keep telling all the time. Well, you were my second child, so I was very blasé about the whole thing. So I woke up in the morning and because I didn't even know about water breaking at that point. We were all so innocent. But anyhow, I was all wet, and then I felt some labor pains, and so I told my husband to call the doctor. And so he gets on the phone to call the doctor to tell him that I'm having these pains. And then in the middle of it, I said, oh, tell the doctor to come here, because the baby was coming very fast. And so I dropped onto the living room couch, and my husband also called his mother, who lived locally, to come. And a doctor was walking up the street, who was the in-law of our downstairs neighbor. They grabbed that doctor off the street, and I proceeded to have you in the living room with my mother-in-law, the strange doctor, and my husband all in attendance. It was like Macy's window.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, a couple of months later, I'm in the supermarket checking out with my 2-year-old toddler, a brand new baby, and the guy checking out in back of me greets me and says, hello, how are you feeling? And I looked at her and I said, I'm sorry, I don't remember you. And he said, oh, I'm one of the drivers on the Whitestone ambulance. I was there watching you have the baby. Stories, this is a wonderful thing about getting to be a real grown-up in your 80s. You have so many stories, you can't even remember them all at one time. Oh, I know another story. As a college student, and this is now post-war, we're back to 1946. The war has ended. Boys have not all come home yet. And so there was a need for somebody to harvest the crops. And so they went to the colleges and looked for anybody that they could get to pick the crops. And they came to Hunter College, and a group of us girls volunteered to go to Greene County, New York, this is all New York City girls, to pick beans. And so we hopped on the pickup truck in Manhattan and drove up to Greene County to pick beans. We got paid 25 cents a bushel, and out of that they took whatever they took for room and board, because we all slept in a big loft, like a dormitory arrangement in a farmhouse. Fortunately, at that time, I was kind of cute. And the man who owned the bean fields for whom we were picking beans was also the Ford Ferguson tractor dealer in the county. And so he asked me if I would come to the county fair with him to help him sell his tractors. And I said, of course. So after my 2-week obligation to pick beans was over, I re-upped. And for the rest of the summer, I went to 3 fairs and sat on the tractor and looked pretty. When the end of the 3rd fair came, it is now August, and you recall I was born in August 26th. My father said, if you don't come home by your birthday, don't bother coming home. So that was the end of my tractor selling. Some of the things that I do remember, and I guess it's the things that we talk about at dinner now, how life was so much safer in those days, and we had such a good time. You didn't have to worry about where your children went. When I was back to those 7th and 8th grade years, we actually got extra credit in school if we went to the Museum of Natural History on the weekend. And so 3, 4, 5, 6 of us would get together in Whitestone and Queens, get on the subway, and go into Manhattan and go into the Bronx and just spend the day there. And nobody worried about us being alone, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 12 and 13. Life was a lot safer then, and we went to the Bronx Zoo, and then of course I was a Bobby Soxer. And some of you may remember Frank Sinatra, and I was one of those that got up early, and we would have to get on the bus, oh, I don't know, 6 o'clock in Whitestone, and go to Flushing, and get on the subway, and go into Manhattan, and stand online at the Paramount, waiting to get in to see Frank Sinatra. And I was one of those in my little saddle shoes, squealing with the best of them. During the war, my dad was an air raid warden, so he was required to make sure that everybody darkened their windows when there was an air raid drill. Fortunately, no planes ever came over. He participated in all kinds of community activities. He wanted to be such a good American, and it broke his heart that his country had kicked him out, that he couldn't be what he really wanted to be initially. My mother and father both did so many community-minded things that we were considered a part of the community even before we became citizens. And a good way that that illustrates that is that the American Legion in Whitestone, New York, nominated me, the daughter of an enemy alien, to be the teenager to represent that post at Girls State, which was quite an honor. And I have never forgotten that a group of World War I veterans could get past that, and the fact that my father had created such a bridge with them, having fought on the other side in that war, that they could say, this girl is worthy of this honor among all the teenagers in Whitestone. So it shows the way Dad operated. My family belonged to the Methodist Church in Whitestone, and they went to church regularly, and we sat in the choir loft and sang in the junior choir and did the requisite amount of giggling, particularly when we sang the song about take my hands and let them be, and then it goes to let my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for thee. And of course I had very big feet, and my sister would sit next to me and point and giggle and giggle and giggle. And my parents would be appalled. Yes. And of course my mother was an assistant scout leader. She just did amazing things to be part of the community. The church organist was our music teacher, initially, Mrs. Marney. And yes, we both took piano lessons. I never grew up to be a great pianist, but I do remember sitting at the piano, many piano stories, pounding out all the songs of the services. You know, Halls of Montezuma and Caissons Go Rolling Along. So I remember learning all those. And the other thing I remember about the piano was the Christmas. And we had a really fine Christmas thing, which I really miss in this country. We had a ceremony at home. We didn't just all dive into a bunch of presents. And the first time I experienced that, I was appalled. But we would gather on Christmas Eve, late afternoon, and we'd all gather around the piano, and we'd sing Christmas carols. And then, darn it, Dad always had to go to the bathroom. And while he was gone, the Christkind rang the little bell that said it was time to go into the Christmas room, which was the living room, which had been off limits to us. So when Dad came back from the bathroom, we had to tell him that the bell had rung and it was time to go. And so we marched single file, the 5 of us, from the youngest to the oldest, into the living room, singing. And then we stood there and we read, everybody read the Christmas story. Everybody had a part assigned to them. And then we sang another Christmas carol, the Christmas story from the Bible. And then we wished everybody Merry Christmas. And then we opened our gifts. I never figured out that my father was in fact the Christkind, but it was my idea of Christmas. There was one Christmas where that tableau was interrupted, and I was so angry, and I was, maybe a teenager. It must have been, yes, I was a teenager, I know exactly. And we had heard the bell, and we were going to go in, and then there was a commercial singing of a Christmas carol. I don't remember who it was now, whether it was Bing Crosby, and I was appalled that somebody should absolutely intrude on this tradition. And so we went into the Christmas room, and it was the Christmas of my sister. It makes me cry now when I think of it. It's a Christmas that my sister and I received our record player. It was our record player with a record on it. It was just a wonderful memory. I hadn't thought of that in a long time. And I carried that tradition through to my own family, and it's just very dear to me. We added some things to it. Our religious beliefs changed over the years a little bit. We were going to the Unitarian Church at that time, and so we picked up some Christmas sayings, words from a Unitarian minister, which became very close to us, and as close as the Bible had been. Family is a strong draw. I spent a wonderful retirement. We had both worked for the state of New York, my second husband and I. So we had the early retirement at 55, and we took it and went to Florida and played outside in the sunshine for all those golden years. And it's a good thing we did, because unfortunately he died young at 69. But then I stayed and loved my time in Florida. But then one morning I woke up and I'd gotten old. And I wasn't playing tennis anymore, and I didn't have my husband anymore. And I said, no, I want to be where family is. And back I went to the snow and the children, and it was a good exchange.
It has certainly been good for me.
Our family had a lovely, lovely camp. And you have to be an upstate New Yorker to know what a camp is. It can be anything from a quite fancy home, a second home in the woods, or it can be what we had, a little shack on a pond off a meadow. But it was heaven. It was one room, and which was a kitchen, living room, dining room, everything together, and then it was 2 bedrooms, sort of. And we had wonderful times there. It was very rustic, and it was on a small lake or a large pond with fish in it, and we had a little rowboat that we called the Rock and Roll, and we had some wonderful times there, often having as many as 11 people, all of us making do with one outhouse and only cold running water, and taking a bath in the lake and so forth. When the cousins were there one time, my children, went out and did some fishing and came back with a whole bunch of bullheads. If you're not from upstate New York, you may not know what bullheads are. They're a second cousin to catfish. And the nice thing is you don't have to take the scales off. They have no scales, so they're very easy to prepare. So they presented me with the bullheads, and I proceeded to chop off their heads and pull their guts out, and they were ready to be cooked. So I chop off a head, and I toss it in a big Pyrex mixing bowl, and I chop off another head, and I clean out the insides. I did this for a dozen. And the next thing you know, the children are laughing and laughing because that whole bowl full of bullheads is going, ark, 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 ark. That's one of the wonderful memories of camp. Camp was a wonderful, wonderful experience for all of us. Another memory, which is really your memory, Dick, rather than mine, except it gave me the freedom to do what I wanted to do, was the summer that your dad and I went to summer school. And summer school was 6 weeks long. And here we had these young boys who were 10 and 12, I believe, at the time. And they had to be somewhere. We couldn't take care of them and go to summer school. So your grandparents, your dad's parents, volunteered to take them to camp. These very rustic conditions, outhouse, only cold running water. We did have refrigeration, but they took these 2 boys to camp for 6 weeks. And they all remember it fondly. The thing that I remember about it is that they taught these 2 kids bridge. They learned how to play bridge. And it was a wonderful time for the 4 of them. They always, always talked about it. And bridge brings up another story, which is about you, Dick, which nobody else may ever know if I don't tell it now, is that the following winter, you came home from Sunday school, actually, and said that some people from the college had come in and they were looking for somebody to play the part of Jake in Annie, Get Your Gun. Jake is the youngest brother of Annie Oakley, and that you had volunteered. And so you became Jake in the college production of Annie, Get Your Gun. So we went to many, many rehearsals, drove night after night, and so there were long waits between different scenes rehearsing, and one night the college kid said, "Hey, we need a 4th for bridge." And nobody answered. Hey, can't anybody fill in for a 4th for bridge while we're waiting? And this 10-year-old kid says, "Yeah, I can play bridge." And they didn't believe it. But he did sit down and play bridge with the college kids. And of course, bridge is a very large part of my life now in my dotage. Playing. And I'm even teaching bridge. I don't know whether you knew I was teaching bridge too, yeah. I didn't speak much about our many moves. The Howard clan is known for moving. We move and move and move. And so finally the day came that we had amassed enough wealth that we were able to buy a house. We had been renting all this time. And we moved from the city of Albany to Voorheesville, a very nice village outside of Albany. And it was a typical little 3-bedroom ranch, 10 little ranch houses in a row that the farmer that owned the land had just sold off the front lots to make some money. And there was a cornfield across the way, and nothing much else to recommend it. And so my husband's brother and his wife came up to visit it, and not before they visited, they talked about it, and they said, well, it has a good school district, doesn't it? I said, I don't know, I never asked. Well, it's close to work, you don't have to commute far. Oh, it's pretty far. Well, it has lots of modern conveniences, a bedroom for each of the kids. I said, no, not really. And she said, well, what the hell did you buy it for, the view? And yes, we did, because out our back window was a beautiful view of the Helderbergs, which we thoroughly loved. That was the house that you grew up in and the school district that you grew up in. And Voorheesville was a wonderful, wonderful experience. It was during those years I finished my degree, started working in 1960. We now had two incomes, so we bought the house in 1960. And I worked in the schools as a school librarian for 6.5 years or so, and then was invited to come to the state to work, which I did for the rest of my career, which was a wonderful move. And I went for the amazing sum of $11,000 a year, which really put us on easy street. It has brought me an absolutely unbelievable retirement, and I often have to stop some of my more conservative friends when they go on about people swilling at the taxpayer's trough, and remind them that their friend sitting with them, namely me, has swilled at the taxpayer's trough for many years. The city of New York provided my undergraduate, or part of my undergraduate. The state of New York provided the rest of my education and provided my job, and then provided me with a retirement, which is just marvelous now. It's a Tier 1 retirement, and I have a great pension, wonderful health insurance, and as I said to somebody just this morning, a stranger that was coming through Avila here, and saying, "Oh, how lovely it is, and do you like it here?" And I said, "Yes, I never thought that I would spend my dotage in a resort." And he laughed. And that's how I feel. I learned to play bridge when I was first married. In fact, the four of us, my husband's brother, and his wife, all learned together, and had many stories with that. My sister-in-law was inclined to be a little fiery-tempered. And one night we were playing bridge at their house, and they lived in an upstairs apartment, in an apartment house on 3rd Avenue, and we were playing bridge at the near this open window in the summer, and they got into a bit of an altercation about the bridge, and my sister-in-law picked up the pack of cards and slammed it down on the table, and it went flying out that 3rd-story apartment window. The other thing I remember with her, whenever her husband started to correct her on what she had done in bidding or in playing, she would point her finger and pound it on the table. The score sheet tells the story. And of course, the girls were always ahead.
Of course.
That's the way we tell the story. We did not have television for many, many years, but we lived in an upstairs apartment and had the two little kids, and so but we would go downstairs to our neighbors, and they invited us to watch some television when they first got their television. And so, of course, we watched the roller derby, as everybody did, and we also watched baseball. The setup was different in those years. There was the pennant race, and there wasn't the championship game and all that stuff. But anyhow, this was a crucial baseball game. And it was a Subway, must have been a series, it was a Subway series. The Dodgers and the Giants were playing. And we had fans of both clubs there. And we got to that famous last inning where Bobby Thompson hits a home run and wins it. And there was absolute bedlam. And we scared that poor little 2-year-old to death. He didn't know why. Everybody screamed, and he cried and cried. Oh, and things changed just so much too culturally. We talk about our thinking about health and all that stuff today, and either how much we didn't know or how much we chose not to believe. And speaking about bridge and health, I sat there at the bridge table, nursing my baby, with a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other. And I would point to that and say, and my children grew up all right. And then my Dick would say back to me, but just think how wonderful I could have been.
One of the memories I have of you growing up is of you graduating from SUNY with your master's. And I remember just being so impressed that my mother had the highest honors.
I didn't even know that you were aware of it at the time.
Oh, I remember that day very clearly.
And that's a good thing to remember about children in general. I was at that point 30 years old. I had started my education back in 1946 and had 2 years at Hunter College, which was absolutely free by that time. Let me digress. We didn't even have to buy our books. They were lent to us. It cost us nothing to go to school. But after the first 2 years, I decided I was almost 20 years old, and it was high time I got married. So I left school and got married and raised my 2 kids, and then went back to school. The first time through, I barely made it through college algebra, and I had a terrible time with some other classes too. I was really struggling. 10 years later, with 2 children, suddenly I'd gotten so much smarter that I was able to graduate summa cum laude. It's amazing. So don't give up on your kids. It sometimes takes a long time to grow up. And you know what they say about growing up.
What do they say?
Growing old is mandatory. Growing up is optional.
I like that.
As you said at the outset, all these stories get a little embellished over time.
Memory is an interesting
Yes.
process.
But it's nice to remember that there were so many good things, so many good times, so many happy memories. And yeah, there was some stuff that wasn't so good. Divorces are not a good thing, and they did happen in our family with some regularity after a while. But it turned out okay. It turned out okay. It surprised me how enjoyable an experience it was. I was a little apprehensive initially, but telling the stories is just something that old folks do, and you just nudge them a little bit and they come out. I'm so glad to have had this opportunity to share.
Jetzt fangen wir zu singen an, zu Lauf es nur ein jeder kann, wird Gottes Lob erkundet, wird Gottes Lob erkundet.